The heavy, ivory silk of Lady Clara Vance's wedding gown felt less like a garment and more like a cage. She stood in the dim vaulted antechamber of St. Jude's Cathedral, hidden behind a massive stone pillar, her breathing shallow and strictly controlled. The air in the corridor was thick with the scent of burning beeswax and the damp chill of an October afternoon. Beyond the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall, 300 of the country's most elite aristocrats sat in the pews waiting for her to walk down the aisle. In her right hand, Clara held a small cream-colored card. It was crumpled at the edges. Written on it, in her neat, deliberate script, were the vows she had spent 3 months drafting. She had written them by the fire in her own quiet drawing room, believing that she was finally stepping out of the shadows. Finally being seen by a man who valued her steady, quiet devotion. Her fingers trembled so violently that the card shook against the stiff lace of her skirt. Less than 10 feet away, concealed within a shallow alcove intended for confessionals, stood Julian Thorne, the Earl of Blackwood. He was not alone. The murmuring voices that had initially drawn Clara away from her bridal suite had sharpened into a clarity that sliced through the cold stone hall. "You cannot go through with this, Julian." The woman's voice was a low, urgent purr, rich with the entitlement of someone who knew she owned the room. Lady Sylvia Croft. Clara recognized the voice instantly. Sylvia was the glittering, sharp-edged socialite who had dominated Julian's youth, the woman who had left him when his family's debts began to mount, only to return whenever she required the validation of his lingering obsession. "Keep your voice down, Sylvia!" Julian hissed, though his tone held no real reprimand. There was a desperate, breathless quality to it. The same tone he had used when he proposed to Clara in the Blackwood Gardens. Though now hearing it, directed at another woman, Clara realized how heavily it had been rehearsed for her. "Why should I?" Sylvia's silhouette shifted against the stone. The emerald velvet of her dress caught the faint light from a high, stained glass window. She stepped closer to him, her hand lifting to rest flat against the lapel of his impeccable midnight blue morning coat. "You're about to shackle yourself to a woman who wears beige to a summer ball. She is a bank ledger, Julian. A terribly dull walking bank ledger." Clara's left hand gripped the fabric of her ivory skirt. Her fingernails dug through the silk, pressing so hard into her thigh that she felt the sting of her own nails. She did not move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, sickening rhythm, but she forced herself to stand perfectly still. Julian let out a ragged breath. "She is a Vance Sylvia." "Do you have any idea what the Blackwood estate owes? If I do not marry her today, the creditors will seize the house, the lands, the titles, everything. She is accommodating. She does not demand much. I'm doing this to save the name." "And what of us?" Sylvia murmured, her thumb tracing the edge of his collar. The silence that followed stretched until it felt as though the very stone of the cathedral was holding its breath. Clara stared at the rough masonry of the pillar inches from her face. She felt the blood draining from her cheeks, leaving her skin as pale and cold as the marble beneath her feet. "I've told you," Julian's voice cracked heavy with the romantic, theatrical agony he so deeply enjoyed. "I am marrying her to survive. But my God, Sylvia, even on our wedding day, it was always you. It will only ever be you." The words struck Clara with the physical force of a blow to the chest. Her throat closed entirely. For a moment, the world tilted, the stained glass blurring into smears of meaningless color. "Even on our wedding day," she heard the rustle of velvet, the sharp intake of breath, the unmistakable sound of a desperate clinging kiss. Clara looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were stark white. The ivory silk of her dress, an heirloom piece that had been tailored to fit her exactly now, bore a deep, jagged crease where she had twisted it in her grip. The vow card in her right hand was crushed beyond saving. She could have stepped out from behind the pillar. She could have walked into the alcove, raised her voice, and shattered the illusion. She could have slapped him, slapped her, wept until her makeup ran, and demanded the apologies that high society fed upon. But Clara was 32 years old, born of old money, and trained since birth that a woman's dignity was the only currency no one could steal unless she handed it over. She did not cry. The pain was there, a vast cold ocean of it, swallowing the quiet hopes she had nurtured for the past year. But beneath the pain, something else was hardening. Something crystalline and sharp. She turned away from the alcove. Her satin heels made no sound on the runner as she walked back the way she came. She did not return to the bridal suite where her bridesmaids were undoubtedly wondering where she had gone. She walked directly toward the heavy oak doors at the rear entrance of the cathedral. Outside, the sky had bruised into a deep stormy purple, and a fine persistent October rain had begun to fall. The cold air hit her face crisp and sobering. Her carriage was waiting in the cobblestone courtyard. The coachman, an older man named Hayes, who had served the Vance family for 2 decades, sat atop the box. He blinked in surprise as his mistress emerged from the cathedral alone 30 minutes before the ceremony was meant to conclude, standing in the rain in a gown meant only for altars and ballrooms. My Lady Hayes called down his brow, furrowing as the rain began to spot the pristine silk of her shoulders. "Open the door," Hayes Clara said. Her voice was remarkably steady. It lacked the warmth it usually carried, stripped down to a flat metallic absolute. Hayes scrambled down from the box and wrenched the carriage door open. He offered his hand. Clara took it, pulling the heavy, wet folds of her dress up as she stepped inside. "To Blackwood, my lady, or back to the Vance estate?" Hayes asked, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere, his eyes darting toward the cathedral doors. Clara settled onto the dark leather seat. She smoothed the ruined crease of her skirt with a slow, deliberate motion. She looked out the window at the looming stone facade of the church where 300 of Julian's peers sat waiting for a financial rescue that was about to drive away. "To my private residence in Mayfair, Hayes," she said quietly. "And do not stop no matter who calls for us." "Yes, my lady." The carriage lurched forward. The iron-rimmed wheels clattered against the wet cobblestones, the sound echoing off the high cathedral walls. As they pulled out into the main street, the grand bells of St. Jude's began to toll, a scheduled joyous ringing meant to signal the final seating of the guests. Clara sat in the shadows of the moving carriage, listening to the bells. The rain lashed against the small glass window, blurring the passing city into grey streaks. The chill of the damp silk seeped through to her skin, but she barely felt it. She opened her right hand. The crumpled vow card sat in her palm. "I vow to stand beside you through the darkest of your winters," she had written. "To be the quiet harbor when the world demands too much. To honor the trust you have placed in me, and to protect the legacy of Blackwood as fiercely as I protect my own." She stared at the ink. 3 months ago, Julian had sat in her drawing room, his head bowed in his hands, playing the part of the noble burdened earl. He had spoken of his family's debts, of the creditors that are circling like vultures, of his fear of losing his ancestral home. And Clara, quietly observing, deeply moved by his vulnerability, had made a decision. She had not told him. She had wanted it to be a wedding gift. Over the past 90 days, using the vast liquid wealth left to her by her late grandfather, Clara had quietly purchased every single promissory note, every mortgage, every lien held against the Blackwood estate. She had bought his debts in full. She had intended to hand him the sealed folder on their wedding night, freeing him from his burdens forever. A terribly dull walking bank ledger, Sylvia had called her. "I am marrying her to survive," Julian had replied. Clara's thumb brushed over the ink of her ruined vows. A slow, terrifyingly calm realization settled over her, chilling her blood far more effectively than the October rain. Julian Thorne did not know it yet. He was currently straightening his midnight blue coat, wiping another woman's lipstick from his mouth, and preparing to walk to the altar to wait for a bride who was already 3 miles away. He believed his creditors were faceless banks and distant lords holding him by the throat. He didn't know that the woman he had just humiliated behind a stone pillar was no longer his savior. She was his sole absolute creditor, and she owned everything he had. Clara placed the crumpled vow card on the leather seat beside her. She unpinned the heavy lace veil from her hair, letting the intricate ash-blonde chignon fall loose against her neck. She took a deep breath, the tight, suffocating panic in her chest dissolving into a cold, diamond-hard clarity. Let him wait at the altar. Let the 300 guests whisper. Let the scandal break over his head like a tidal wave. Clara closed her eyes, the rhythm of the carriage wheels carrying her away from the ruins of her naivety and toward the absolute perfection of her revenge. The carriage ride from St. Jude's Cathedral to Mayfair took exactly 42 minutes. For the entirety of that journey, Clara did not weep. She sat in the dim interior, the steady drumming of the October rain against the roof, acting as a metronome to her racing thoughts. The chill of the damp air seeped through the carriage walls, but the cold settling deep inside her chest had nothing to do with the weather. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap over the heavy folds of the ivory silk gown. They had stopped trembling. The adrenaline of the initial shock, the physical blow of hearing the man she loved declare his eternal devotion to another woman was receding. In its place, a pristine diamond-hard clarity was taking form. She turned her gaze to the carriage window, watching the blurred shapes of London pass by. The wet cobblestones reflected the dull grey light of the afternoon. As she stared at her own pale reflection in the glass, the ghost of a memory surfaced, unbidden but fiercely relevant. It was a memory from exactly 3 weeks ago. The heavy, polished mahogany doors of the Bank of London, the scent of old paper and expensive cigars. She had sat across from Mr. Sterling, her family's most trusted wealth manager, a man who had served the Vance estate since before she was born. "Are you entirely certain of this, Lady Clara?" Mr. Sterling had asked, his voice hushed, his grey eyebrows drawn tightly together. He had pushed a staggering stack of ledgers across the desk toward her. "The Blackwood debts are not a small misfortune. They are a catastrophe. Generations of mismanagement, gambling, and sheer arrogance. If you purchase these promissory notes, you are absorbing a financial black hole. Your grandfather left you a fortune, yes. But this is a massive liability." Clara remembered the soft, foolish smile that had touched her lips then. The smile of a woman who believed she was building a fortress for the man she loved. "I am certain, Mr. Sterling," she had replied, picking up the gold fountain pen. "Julian has carried the weight of his family's ruin for too long. He's a proud man. I do not want our marriage to begin with him feeling indebted to me. By purchasing these notes privately through holding companies, he will never know it was me. He will simply be told his debts have been consolidated and cleared. I'm giving him his freedom." She had signed her name across 12 different transfer documents. With each stroke of the pen, she had quietly, happily purchased the survival of the Blackwood name. Now sitting in the cold carriage, Clara closed her eyes. A bitter, soundless laugh rose in her throat, lodging there like a piece of shattered glass. "I am marrying her to survive," Julian had told Sylvia in the Cathedral alcove. He had viewed her not as a harbour, but as a transaction. A dull walking bank ledger. He was right, she realized with a terrifying calm. She was a ledger, and ledgers required balancing. The carriage slowed the iron wheels, grinding to a halt, before the towering, wrought iron gates of her Mayfair residence. It was a beautiful, imposing townhouse of pale Portland stone purchased entirely with her own inheritance. It did not belong to Julian. It did not belong to the Blackwood estate. It belonged exclusively to her. Hayes, the coachman, opened the door holding a large black umbrella against the driving rain. Clara stepped down. The hem of her ivory wedding gown dragged across the wet pavement, soaking up the muddy water, ruining the priceless silk. She did not care. She walked up the broad stone steps, her posture perfectly straight, her pale green eyes fixed on the heavy front doors. The doors swung open before she reached them. Carson, her elderly butler, stood in the entryway. His professional composure shattered the moment he saw her. He looked past her toward the empty street, expecting the Earl of Blackwood's carriage, expecting a husband, expecting a crowd. There was only the rain and his mistress standing alone in a ruined wedding dress. "My lady," Carson breathed, taking a step back. Has something happened? Where is the Earl?" "Close the door, Carson," Clara said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It was stripped of its usual gentle cadence, reduced to a flat, echoing command. Carson immediately pulled the heavy doors shut, cutting off the sound of the rain. The grand foyer of the Mayfair house was suddenly perfectly suffocatingly quiet. "Summon Martha to my chambers," Clara instructed, not stopping as she moved toward the sweeping marble staircase. "And instruct the staff that no one is to be admitted to this house. Not today, not tomorrow. If the Earl of Blackwood arrives at these gates, he is to be turned away. If he attempts to force entry, you will summon the constabulary." Carson swallowed hard, his eyes wide. "Yes, my lady." Clara ascended the stairs. The weight of the wet silk felt unbearable, now dragging her down like iron chains. She reached her private chambers, pushing the double doors open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn against the storm. She walked directly to the center of the room and stopped staring blankly at the cold fireplace. A moment later, the door clicked open. Martha, her lady's maid, hurried in. She took one look at Clara's face and the muddy, ruined hem of the gown and clapped a hand over her mouth. "Do not ask Martha," Clara said quietly. "Just help me take this off, now!" Martha moved quickly, her fingers flying over the dozens of tiny pearl buttons that lined the back of the gown. It had taken over an hour that morning to lace Clara into the corset and secure the heavy silk. Now the removal was frantic, almost violent. Clara pulled her arms free, and the heavy ivory gown slid from her shoulders, collapsing into a puddle of ruined white fabric on the hardwood floor. It looked like a discarded ghost, the ghost of a naive woman who had died in the stone alcove of St. Jude's. Clara unlaced the corset herself, pulling the strings until she could breathe again. The air rushed into her lungs sharp and cold. She stepped out of the pool of silk, leaving it exactly where it fell. She walked to her wardrobe, ignoring the soft pastel dresses she usually wore, the colors Julian had claimed suited her quiet nature. Instead, she reached for a dark charcoal grey dressing gown made of heavy silk. She wrapped it around herself, pulling the belt tight, feeling the sleek dark fabric armor her skin. "Draw a bath," Clara said to Martha, who was staring at the discarded wedding dress in horror. "And then bring me a pot of strong black tea." In the study. "Yes, my lady," Martha whispered, fleeing the room. Clara walked to her vanity mirror. She stared at the woman looking back at her. The elaborate ash blonde chignon was ruined strands of hair clinging to her damp neck. Her pale porcelain skin was devoid of color. But her eyes, those pale green eyes that Julian had always called gentle, were entirely transformed. They were entirely, utterly dead. While Clara was locking herself in her study 3 miles away, the atmosphere inside St. Jude's Cathedral had shifted from polite anticipation to suffocating tension. The grand organ had been playing for 45 minutes. The organist, a nervous young man, was running out of improvisational hymns. The 300 guests in the pews were no longer sitting in reverent silence. A low, persistent hum of whispers had broken out, filling the vaulted ceilings like the buzzing of a disturbed hive. At the altar, Julian Thorne was sweating. The midnight blue morning coat tailored to perfection suddenly felt like a straitjacket. He pulled slightly at his collar, his prominent Roman nose flared as he breathed in the heavy scent of incense and damp wool. He looked down the long red-carpeted aisle for the 20th time. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral remained firmly closed. Where is she? He thought, a spike of genuine panic piercing through his chest. Clara was never late. Clara was punctual, accommodating, predictable. She was the safest choice he had ever made. He glanced to the third pew on the left. Lady Sylvia Croft sat there, her emerald velvet dress standing out brilliantly against the dark suits of the men around her. She caught his eye and raised a single perfectly arched brow. Her expression was a mixture of amusement and irritation. Just minutes ago in the alcove, Julian had felt like a tragic romantic hero torn between duty and passion. Now standing alone at the altar of a church packed with the most powerful people in London, he felt like a fool. Julian leaned slightly to his right, gesturing to his best man, Lord Hastings. "Go to the antechamber," Julian hissed under his breath. "Find her maid, find anyone. Tell them we are losing the patience of the Archbishop." Hastings nodded tightly and hurried down the side aisle, slipping through a discreet stone archway near the back of the church. Julian stood facing the crowd, forcing a rigid, confident smile onto his face. The whispers were growing louder. He could see the Duke of Somerset checking his pocket watch. He could see the whispers being exchanged behind feathered fans. These were not just his peers. These were his creditors, his judges, the people whose respect he desperately needed to maintain the illusion of Blackwood's solvency. If this wedding did not happen, his creditors would descend on his estate by Monday morning. The bank would repossess the house. He would be ruined. 5 excruciating minutes later, Hastings returned. He didn't walk down the aisle. He approached the altar from the side, his face completely drained of color. He stepped up beside Julian, ignoring the questioning look of the Archbishop. "Julian," Hastings whispered, his voice trembling. "Where is she?" Julian demanded, maintaining his frozen smile for the crowd. "Is it her dress? Did she tear the fabric?" "She's not there, Julian." Julian's smile slipped. "What do you mean she's not there? She's in the bridal suite. I went to the suite." Hastings said, his eyes darting to the murmuring crowd. Her bridesmaids are there completely bewildered. They said Clara stepped out to get some air before the procession. She never returned. I went outside to the courtyard. Julian. Her carriage is gone. The Vance coachman took her away 20 minutes ago. Julian stared at him, the words making no sense. Gone to where? I don't know, Hastings hissed. But she left the church. She is gone. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over Julian, starting at the base of his spine and radiating outward. Clara Vance had left. The quiet, devoted, desperate to please woman had simply walked out of the cathedral. Why his mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Did she panic? Did the pressure of the title frighten her? He refused to consider any other possibility. She could not possibly know about Sylvia. He had been so careful. They had only spoken in whispers in the empty stone corridor. She couldn't have heard. Julian Hastings nudged him. You have to say something, the crowd is turning. Julian looked out at the 300 faces staring at him. The whispering had stopped. They were waiting for an explanation. The silence was heavy, oppressive, demanding blood. He stepped forward, leaving the altar behind. His hands were shaking, so he clasped them tightly behind his back. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing loudly in the massive stone space. My lords, ladies, and esteemed guests. Julian began projecting his voice, summoning every ounce of his aristocratic training to mask his terror. I deeply apologize for this delay. It appears that the overwhelming emotion of the day, coupled with a sudden and severe illness, has rendered Lady Clara unable to proceed with the ceremony this afternoon. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Sylvia, in the third row, snapped her painted silk fan shut with a sharp clack. Her health must of course be my first priority. Julian continued lying smoothly, though he felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. She has been taken to her physicians. We will postpone the ceremony until she is fully recovered. I thank you all for your presence and your understanding. He turned and walked rapidly down the side aisle, not looking at anyone, his strides long and desperate. He had to find her. He had to fix this. He had to drag her back to an altar before the banks realized he had failed to secure the Vance fortune. Back in Mayfair, the rain continued to beat against the tall windows of the study. Clara stood by the massive oak desk, the dark charcoal silk of her dressing gown absorbing the dim light of the crackling fire. The pot of black tea sat untouched on a silver tray. In her hands she held a heavy iron key. She walked toward the wall opposite the fireplace, where an oil painting of her late grandfather hung. She pulled the painting aside, revealing a heavy steel wall safe. She inserted the key, turned it, and pulled the heavy door open. Inside, sitting on the cold metal shelf, was a thick, leather-bound legal folder. It was sealed with red wax. Clara pulled the folder out and carried it to her desk. She broke the wax seal with her thumb and opened it. Inside lay dozens of thick, cream-colored pages. They were promissory notes, foreclosure agreements, and property deeds. And at the bottom of every single page was the messy, arrogant signature of Julian Thorne, the Earl of Blackwood. These were the debts she had bought, the chains she had intended to break for him. Clara reached into the pocket of her dressing gown. She pulled out the crumpled vow card she had carried out of the cathedral. She placed it on the desk right next to the stack of his financial ruin, the delicate ruined ink of her love sitting shoulder to shoulder with the cold, hard mathematics of his destruction. She looked at the documents, her pale green eyes reflecting the dancing flames of the fire. The woman who had wanted to save him was dead, buried under the heavy ivory silk on her bedroom floor. The woman standing here now owned him entirely, and she was going to tear his aristocratic world down to the foundation. The morning after the cathedral was entirely devoid of rain. The October sun broke over Mayfair with a brittle, blinding clarity, the kind of light that offered no warmth, only an unforgiving exposure of everything it touched. Inside the Vance townhouse, the silence was absolute. Clara stood in the center of her dressing room, watching as her lady's maid Martha moved hesitantly through the massive wardrobes. Over the past year, Julian had casually mentioned his preferences for women's fashion. He liked soft colors, dove grays, pale pinks, delicate lilacs, and soft ivories. He had claimed they suited Clara's gentle and forgiving nature. Clara had spent thousands altering her wardrobe to match the aesthetic of the perfect yielding aristocratic wife. Take them all, Clara said, her voice smooth and devoid of inflection. Martha paused, holding a beautiful cascade of blush-colored silk. All of the pastels, my lady, even the evening gowns. Everything that is soft, Clara commanded, turning her pale green eyes to the mirror. Box them. Have them sent to the charity wards by noon. I do not want to see a single ribbon of pink or lace remaining in this house. Yes, my lady, and what shall I lay out for you today? The charcoal wool suit, Clara said. The one with the structured shoulders and the silver buttons. And have the tailor sent for this afternoon. I require new riding habits, in black navy and slate. When Clara descended the grand marble staircase an hour later, the physical transformation was startling. The woman who had worn the heavy, suffocating ivory wedding gown was gone. In her place was a silhouette composed entirely of sharp lines and dark-tailored precision. Her ash-blonde hair, usually worn in soft romantic waves, was pulled back into a severe immaculate chignon at the nape of her neck. There was no rouge on her porcelain cheeks. She looked like a blade that had finally been drawn from its sheath. Mr. Sterling, the senior partner of the Vance family's legal and financial trust, was already waiting in the study. He stood up abruptly as Clara entered, his seasoned eyes widening slightly at the stark change in her demeanor. Lady Clara! Mr. Sterling bowed. I came as quickly as I received your summons. I must admit the news of the postponed nuptials has thrown the financial district into a mild panic. The Blackwood creditors are already whispering. They have no reason to whisper, Mr. Sterling, Clara said, walking around the massive oak desk and taking her seat. Because the Blackwood creditors no longer exist. I hold the entirety of Julian Thorne's debt. We finalized the last of the private acquisitions last week. Yes, my lady, Sterling said, cautiously taking the seat opposite her, which was done under the assumption that you would be the Countess of Blackwood by yesterday afternoon. The debts are legally yours, held through our proxy firms. What are your instructions regarding them now? Clara reached out and placed her hand flat on the leather-bound folder she had retrieved from her safe the night before. Inside lay the promissory notes, the mortgages on the Blackwood estate, and the liens on the Blackwood farmlands. What are the precise terms of the promissory notes, Mr. Sterling? The ones bearing the Earl's signature. Sterling adjusted his spectacles, his tone shifting into professional legal detachment. Given the severe financial distress of the Blackwood estate, the previous note holders demanded extreme terms. The debts are classified as callable upon demand, meaning the holder of the note can demand payment in full at any time without prior cause. And if payment is not produced, default, Sterling said simply. Immediate forfeiture of the collateral. In this case, the collateral is the Blackwood ancestral home, the remaining unentailed lands, and the liquid assets of the estate. If the debt is called and he cannot pay, which we know for a fact he cannot, Julian Thorne will be rendered entirely bankrupt within a matter of days. Clara looked at the folder. She thought of the stone alcove. She thought of Julian's desperate, breathless voice. She is a terribly dull walking bank ledger. I am marrying her to survive. Call them, Clara said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it struck the quiet room like a hammer on an anvil. Sterling blinked. Call them, my lady, all of them. If we issue a notice of default on the entirety of the debt at once, it will not just ruin him, it will obliterate the Blackwood name. It is a financial guillotine. Then let it fall to a... Clara said, her pale green eyes locking onto the older man's face. Draft the notice of default today. Use the proxy firm's letterhead. I do not want my name on the document yet. Issue the demand for full payment within 14 days. When he fails to pay, we seize the estate. Sterling looked at her for a long, silent moment. He had managed her grandfather's ruthless business empire for 30 years. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of a predator that had finally stopped pretending to be prey. It shall be done by this afternoon, Lady Clara. While the Vance legal team worked with quiet, lethal efficiency, Julian Thorne sat in the sunlit morning room of the Blackwood estate, holding a silver fountain pen and nursing a glass of brandy. It had been 3 days since Clara had vanished from St. Jude's Cathedral. Julian's initial panic had gradually mutated into a strange, arrogant irritation. He had spent the first 24 hours terrified that his creditors would descend, but the weekend had passed and the banks remained silent. To Julian, this meant the crisis was manageable. He had convinced himself of a highly convenient narrative. Clara was a sheltered, sensitive woman. She must have experienced a bout of severe nervous anxiety, a bride's panic. Or perhaps she had seen him speaking to Sylvia from afar, and in a fit of quiet provincial jealousy had fled. She could not possibly have heard the actual conversation. Clara was too meek, too devoted to him, to have orchestrated anything malicious. She was simply sulking in Mayfair, waiting for him to soothe her. He dipped his pen into the inkwell, and began his fourth letter to her. My dearest darling Clara, I am writing to you again, trusting that the exhaustion and nervous distress that overtook you on our wedding day has begun to pass. The physicians assure me that such sudden panics are common in women of a delicate constitution. I have managed the social fallout perfectly, my love. The society pages believe you are resting. Please write to me and tell me when I may call upon you. We have a life to begin and a legacy to secure. Forever your devoted Julian. He signed it with a flourish, folded the heavy parchment, and sealed it with the Blackwood crest. He handed it to his footman. Have this delivered to the Vance townhouse in Mayfair immediately, Julian ordered. And tell the courier he is not to leave without a reply. The footman bowed and departed. Julian took a sip of his brandy, feeling immensely satisfied with his own handling of the situation. He was the Earl of Blackwood. Women threw tantrums and men managed them. Clara would read. The letter feel appropriately cherished and returned to him. The Vance fortune would be his by the end of the month. Later that afternoon, feeling emboldened, Julian ordered his carriage to take him to Hyde Park. The autumn air was crisp and the park was filled with the glittering elite of London society. Julian walked along the promenade, his head held high, nodding to his peers, projecting the image of a patient, understanding groom waiting for his sickly bride to recover. Julian, darling! The voice purred from behind him. He turned to find Lady Sylvia Croft entirely unapologetic and radiantly beautiful in a dark plum walking dress. She stepped into step beside him, opening her parasol to shield her flawless olive skin from the October sun. Sylvia, Julian murmured, casting a quick glance around to see who was watching. We shouldn't be seen speaking so intimately. The rumors about Clara's departure are already swirling. Sylvia let out a light, mocking laugh. Oh, let them swirl. Everyone knows the Vance girl is as fragile as spun glass. Half the club is taking bets on whether she simply fainted from the terror of finally having a man look at her. Julian offered a tight conspiratorial smile, allowing his vanity to be stroked. She is highly sensitive. It requires a gentle hand. And you have such gentle hands, Julian, Sylvia murmured, stepping just close enough that her shoulder brushed his. But surely you cannot be expected to sit in the dark at Blackwood while she recovers her nerves. Come to the opera with me on Thursday. Sit in my family's box. Let society see that the Earl of Blackwood is not to be humiliated by a runaway spinster. Julian hesitated. It was a terrible idea. Showing himself in public with Sylvia Croft mere days after his wedding collapse would fuel the scandal to monumental heights. But looking at Sylvia, at the sharp, glittering amusement in her dark eyes, at the woman he had always craved but could never afford, his legendary arrogance won out over his caution. Clara was trapped in her house, blindly in love with him. She would never know. And even if she did, she was too passive to do anything about it. Thursday, Julian agreed softly. I will be there. Sylvia smiled, her eyes flashing with a triumphant, predatory light. She had marked her territory, and the Earl of Blackwood had submitted perfectly. What neither Julian nor Sylvia knew as they walked side by side through the sunlit park was that the ground beneath their feet had already been hollowed out. Back in Mayfair, Carson, the butler walked into Clara's study carrying a silver tray. On it rested Julian's fourth letter, bearing the unbroken wax seal of the Blackwood crest. Clara sat at her desk, the charcoal wool of her suit blending into the dark leather of her chair. She looked at the letter. Beside it on the desk sat the first 3 letters Julian had sent over the past few days. None of them had been opened. The seals remained perfectly intact. The courier was quite insistent on waiting for a reply, my lady, Carson said softly. Clara picked up the letter. She did not read it. She did not even look at Julian's handwriting. She simply dropped it onto the small silver tray holding the previous 3. Tell the courier there is no reply, Clara said. And Carson. Yes, my lady. If another letter arrives bearing the Blackwood crest, you are to burn it in the kitchen fires before it reaches this floor. I will not have my house cluttered with his delusions. Cadson bowed low. "Understood, my lady." As the butler left the room, Mr. Sterling entered through the side door carrying a sleek black leather portfolio. He walked to Clara's desk and extracted a single heavy document. It was stamped with the seal of the proxy firm that managed Clara's assets. It was the notice of default. "It is ready, Lady Clara," Sterling said, placing the document and a gold fountain pen before her. "Once this is signed, it will be delivered by a legal courier directly into the hands of Julian Thorne. The 14-day countdown to foreclosure will officially begin." Clara looked at the document. It was a simple piece of paper covered in legal phrasing, but to her it was the sound of the heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Cathedral closing behind her. It was the sound of the rain against her carriage window. It was the price of her ruined vows. She picked up the gold pen. Her hand did not tremble. Her breathing was slow and even. With a swift, elegant stroke, she signed her name, sealing the absolute and irreversible destruction of the man who thought she was nothing more than a dull walking bank ledger. Thursday evening descended upon London with a biting chill. Inside the master suite of the Blackwood estate, Julian Thorne stood before his gilded floor-length mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal evening suit. He was preparing for the opera. He was preparing to be seen to project the image of an untouchable aristocrat, who was merely indulging his delicate, absent bride by granting her time to recover. He reached for his gold pocket watch, the signature timepiece that had belonged to his father, checking the hour. He was set to collect Lady Sylvia Croft in exactly 20 minutes. The thought of stepping into her family's private box, feeling the collective gaze of high society upon them, filled him with a heady, arrogant warmth. A sharp knock at the bedroom door interrupted his reverie. "Enter," Julian commanded, not looking away from the mirror as he perfected the knot of his silk cravat. His valet stepped into the room holding a silver tray. He looked deeply uncomfortable. "My lord, a courier has just arrived at the front door. He refused to hand this to anyone but you directly. He cited legal urgency." Julian frowned. He turned from the mirror, his annoyance briefly flaring. "Legal urgency? At this hour it is likely just Sterling and company sending the quarterly restructuring forms. Bring it here." The valet extended the tray. Sitting upon the polished silver was a thick, heavy envelope, made of rigid parchment. It did not bear the wax crest of a noble house, nor did it have the delicate looping handwriting he had been expecting from Clara. It bore the stark, unfeeling stamp of a high-tier financial proxy firm. Julian picked it up. The paper felt unnaturally heavy in his hands. "Dismissed," Julian muttered, waving the valet away. When the door clicked shut, Julian walked over to his mahogany desk. He broke the seal with a silver letter opener, slightly annoyed that a banking matter was delaying his evening. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. The first page was a cover letter. Julian scanned the opening paragraph, his eyes skipping over the dense legal jargon until they locked onto a bolded, capitalized phrase in the center of the page. "Notice of acceleration and demand for payment. In full." Julian's breath hitched. He read the sentence again, sure that he had misunderstood. But the words remained stubbornly, violently unchanged. "Hereby declare the principal of and oral accrued interest on all promissory notes held by the principal creditor to be immediately due and payable. The total sum of £420,000 must be remitted within 14 days of the date of this notice." 14 days, Julian whispered to the empty room. "This is impossible. They cannot call the entire debt at once. I have a gentleman's agreement with the banks." His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, sickening rhythm that echoed in his ears. His hands, previously steady, began to shake so violently that the heavy parchment rattled. He flipped to the second page, scanning the list of collateral that would be seized upon default. The Blackwood estate and all its furnishings, the unentailed agricultural lands in Somerset, the London townhouse, all liquid assets currently held in the Blackwood name. Everything! They were demanding everything. If he could not produce an astronomical sum of money in 2 weeks, he would not just be poor, he would be utterly destroyed. He would be turned out into the street. The Earl of Blackwood would be nothing more than a homeless beggar in a tailored suit. Who authorized this? Julian gasped, his chest tightening as if a physical weight were crushing his lungs. He flipped frantically to the final page, searching for the signature of the bank executive who had dared to break their unspoken truce. He found the proxy firm's stamp, and directly beneath it signed in a neat, deliberate, and undeniably familiar script was the name of the principal creditor, the sole owner of his debt, Lady Clara Vance. Julian stopped breathing. The silence in the master's suite became absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like hammer strikes. Julian stared at the signature. The ink seemed to mock him, perfectly steady, perfectly composed. Clara, the woman who wore pastel colors, the woman who spoke softly, the woman he had called a dull walking bank ledger behind a stone pillar just days ago. She did not just have wealth, she had purchased his entire existence. She had held the executioner's axe behind her back while he stood at the altar and humiliated her. She heard everything. Julian realized the truth crashing down upon him with the force of a collapsing building. She did not flee out of nerves. She did not faint. She heard what I said to Sylvia, and she went home and pulled the trigger. The heavy legal document slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a soft, final thud. Julian stumbled backward, his legs giving out. He caught himself on the edge of his desk, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He was ruined. Clara was not sulking. She was hunting. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized his mind. He needed help. He needed an ally. His mind immediately jumped to Sylvia. Sylvia, who understood how the world worked. Sylvia, who possessed the sharpest mind in his social circle. She would know what to do. Her family had influence. Perhaps they could intercede or offer a bridge loan. Julian did not wait for his carriage. He threw on his overcoat, abandoning his pristine appearance, and rushed out of the estate. He hailed a passing hansom cab, shouting the address of the Croft townhouse. The ride felt like an eternity. When he arrived at the elegant Croft residence, he bypassed the footman entirely, rushing up the grand staircase to the private drawing room, where he knew Sylvia would be waiting before the opera. He burst through the double doors. Sylvia was standing before an ornate mirror, a maid carefully adjusting the clasp of a magnificent diamond necklace around her throat. She looked breathtaking in a gown of deep emerald silk, the very picture of aristocratic perfection. She turned a brilliant, seductive smile already forming on her lips. "Julian, darling, you are early and looking terribly." Her smile vanished instantly when she saw his face. Julian was pale, sweating, his cravat loosened, and his eyes wide with a wild, hunted desperation. "Leave us!" Sylvia snapped at her maid. The girl practically ran from the room, pulling the doors shut behind her. "What in God's name has happened to you?" Sylvia demanded, her tone laced with immediate distaste. She despised weakness, and Julian was currently radiating it. "You look like a madman. We are expected at the opera in less than an hour." "There will be no opera. Sylvia!" Julian gasped, crossing the room and grabbing her upper arms. His grip was entirely too tight. "We are ruined. I am ruined." Sylvia wrenched herself out of his grasp, smoothing the silk of her sleeves. "Keep your hands to yourself, Julian. What do you mean you are ruined?" "Has the Vance girl finally made a public statement?" Clara didn't make a statement. Julian choked out, pacing the floor like a trapped animal. "She sent a legal courier. Sylvia, the debts, the Blackwood debts. The banks do not own them. They haven't owned them for months." Sylvia frowned, her dark eyes narrowing. "Then who does—" Julian stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and frantic. "Clara. Clara owns them. She bought every single promissory note. She bought the mortgage to the estate. And she has just issued a notice of default. She has called the debt in full. 14 days, Sylvia. If I do not pay her £420,000 in 14 days, she will seize the house, the lands, everything. I will be bankrupt." For a long moment, Sylvia did not speak. She simply stared at him. The silence in the drawing room was entirely different from the panicked silence in Julian's bedroom. This silence was calculating. It was the silence of an adding machine tallying up a column of numbers and finding the total woefully insufficient. "Clara Vance," Sylvia said slowly, her voice eerily calm, "is your sole creditor." "Yes," Julian cried, stepping toward her, desperate for the warmth and reassurance she had offered him in the cathedral alcove. "She must have heard us, Sylvia. She heard what I said at the wedding. This is her revenge, but we can fight this. Your father has friends in the judiciary. We can file an injunction. We can—" "Stop talking, Julian," Sylvia said. The command was so cold, so devoid of any affection, that Julian froze in his tracks. He looked at her. Sylvia's face had transformed. The seductive, adoring expression she had worn for years whenever she looked at the Earl of Blackwood was completely gone. In its place was a look of pure, clinical disgust. My father, Sylvia said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute ice, will not lift a single finger for a man who has just been publicly outmaneuvered by a woman everyone thought was a fool. An injunction against a legally binding promissory note held by the Vance Trust you are dreaming. Sylvia. Julian breathed, unable to comprehend the sudden shift in her demeanor. You said you loved me. In the church you said... In the church... Sylvia interrupted, stepping back from him, as though his poverty might be contagious. You were the Earl of Blackwood. You possessed one of the largest estates in the country, even if it was heavily mortgaged. You were about to secure the Vance fortune. You had power, Julian, or at least the illusion of it. She walked over to a velvet armchair and picked up her silk evening gloves, pulling them on with precise, deliberate movements. I am a Croft, she continued, not looking at him. My family requires alliances of power, not charity cases. If a Clara Vance seizes your estate, your title becomes a joke, a ghost story. You will have no money, no land, no society standing. You will be nothing. Julian felt the floor drop out from beneath him. The air in the room grew terribly thin. You are abandoning me because I lost the money. Sylvia finally looked up, her dark, glittering eyes devoid of a single ounce of pity. Did you truly think I spent years waiting in the wings for you? Because of your charming personality, I wanted the estate, Julian. I wanted the title backed by the Vance money. If you cannot provide, that you are of absolutely no use to me. But I chose you! Julian shouted, his voice cracking with the agony of total betrayal. I told her I loved you. I destroyed my marriage for you. And what a spectacular miscalculation that was, Sylvia sneered. She walked past him, heading for the drawing room doors. Don't call on me again, Julian. My staff will be instructed to turn you away. I have an opera to attend. I hear the Duke of Somerset will be in the adjacent box, and unlike you, his estate is entirely unencumbered. The heavy double doors shut with a definitive click. Julian Thorne was left standing completely alone in the center of the Croft drawing room. The reality of his situation crashed over him like a suffocating wave. He had traded the quiet, devoted woman who had secretly handed him the world for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a stepping stone. He had lost everything. He had no estate. He had no Sylvia. There was only one person left in all of London who held his life in her hands. Julian stumbled out of the Croft townhouse and into the freezing October night. The rain had begun to fall again, mixing with the fog to turn the streets into a grey nightmare. He walked blindly, the bespoke charcoal suit soaking through the cold, seeping deep into his bones. He had to go to Mayfair. He had to go to Clara. He had to fall on his knees and beg the walking bank ledger to spare his life. The 14th day arrived with a hard white November frost that clung to the sweeping lawns of the Blackwood estate. Inside the Grand Library, the fire had burned down to grey ash. The vast room lined from floor to ceiling with the leather-bound history of the Thorne family was bitterly cold and completely silent. Julian Thorne sat in a high-backed leather chair near the dead hearth. He looked nothing like the polished, charismatic Earl who had stood at the altar of St. Jude's 2 weeks prior. His face was unshaven, the hollows beneath his cheekbones darkened by 14 days of sleepless terror. The collar of his once immaculate white shirt was unbuttoned and wrinkled. An empty crystal decanter of scotch sat on the floor near his feet. For 2 weeks, he had tried everything. He had gone to the Mayfair townhouse every single day, only to find the wrought iron gates padlocked, and the guards strictly instructed to turn him away. He had written letters until his hand cramped, sending them off with couriers, who returned hours later with the envelopes unopened. He had humiliated himself by visiting the offices of Sterling and Company, begging for an extension only to be met with blank professional stares and the repeated assertion that the principal creditor declined to negotiate. He had even tried to rally his society friends, the men he drank with, at his clubs, the lords he shot with in Scotland. But word of the impending foreclosure had spread through London like a plague. The aristocrats who had once clapped him on the shoulder now crossed the street to avoid him. Sylvia's brutal assessment had proven entirely correct. Without the estate, he was a ghost. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon. The deadline had passed. Julian buried his face in his hands, waiting for the sound of bailiffs, for the heavy boots of the constabulary coming to forcibly remove him from his ancestral home. Instead, he heard the crunch of carriage wheels on the frosted gravel of the main drive. Julian's head snapped up. A desperate, pathetic surge of hope flared in his chest. Clara. It had to be Clara. She had let the clock run out to torture him to prove her point, but she was here now. She was a gentle woman. She had loved him. She would not truly throw him out into the winter cold. She had come to forgive him. He scrambled to his feet, swaying slightly from the lingering scotch, and rushed toward the library doors. He did not make it halfway across the Persian rug before the heavy oak doors swung inward. The woman who stepped over the threshold was Clara Vance, but she was a stranger to him. There was not a trace of pastel silk or soft yielding lace to be found on her. She wore a tailored charcoal grey riding habit made of heavy wool, its sharp lapels fastened with cold silver buttons. Her ash blonde hair was pulled back with severe precision. She wore black leather gloves and held a silver-tipped riding crop loosely in her right hand. She did not look at him when she entered. She looked at the room. Her pale green eyes swept the high ceilings, the towering shelves, the intricate moldings assessing the architecture with the clinical detachment of a new owner, evaluating her property. Clara, Julian breathed. His voice cracked, sounding wretched and small in the cavernous room. Clara's gaze finally settled on him. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no sorrow, no betrayal, no lingering trace of the woman who had wept in the carriage. There was only an endless, terrifying sheet of ice. "You are trespassing, Julian," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, stripped of any warmth. It did not echo, but it commanded the space entirely. Julian staggered forward, stopping a few feet from her. He reached out his hands, trembling, but the absolute stillness of her posture made him drop them before he could touch her. "Clara, my love, please." Julian begged the words, tumbling out in a frantic rush. "You have made your point. You have terrified me. You have brought me to my knees. I'm begging you, call off Sterling. I know you are hurt. I know what you must have heard in the cathedral, but it meant nothing. It was a moment of panic. A foolish, meaningless mistake. A mistake," Clara repeated, tasting the word. She walked past him, her leather riding boots clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor between the rugs. She moved toward the massive mahogany desk that had belonged to his father. "Yes." Julian spun around to follow her. "Sylvia meant nothing to me. I was overwhelmed by the pressure of the wedding, the debts. I was out of my mind, but I chose you. I was at the altar waiting for you. I want you, Clara. Only you." Clara stopped behind the desk. She placed her riding crop on the polished wood. She unbuttoned her black leather gloves, pulling them off one by one, her movements unhurried and precise. "You did not choose me, Julian," Clara said, looking down at her bare hands. "You chose a rescue line. You chose a bank ledger. And when you were standing in the alcove, pressing another woman against the stone, you told her the absolute truth. I was the price of your survival. She was the one you wanted. She tricked me." Julian cried, his voice rising in pitch, desperate to shift the blame. "She cornered me. She is a venomous, manipulative woman, Clara. She abandoned me the very night I received your notice. The moment the money was gone, she turned her back on me. She does not know how to love. Not like you do. You have a good, pure heart." Clara finally looked up at him. The corner of her mouth twitched, not into a smile, but into something infinitely sharper. "Do not insult my intelligence by blaming a woman who is only acting in her own self-interest." Clara said, her voice dropping a fraction, the coldness in it deepening. "Sylvia Croft is a mercenary. She is entirely honest about what she is. The only liar in that alcove was you. You lied to her about your courage, and you lied to me about your heart. Clara, I am sorry. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Just do not take the house. Do not take Blackwood. It is my name. It is who I am." "It was who you were," Clara corrected smoothly. She reached into the inside pocket of her charcoal jacket and withdrew a folded cream-colored card. She dropped it onto the center of the mahogany desk. Julian stared at it. It was crumpled, the edges bent, the thick parchment bearing the deep creases of having been crushed in a tightly clenched fist. "Read it," Clara commanded. Julian approached the desk as if approaching a loaded weapon. His hands shook as he reached out and picked up the card. He recognized her neat, deliberate handwriting. He smoothed the paper out, his eyes scanning the ink. "I vow to stand beside you through the darkest of your winters, to be the quiet harbor when the world demands too much, to honor the trust you have placed in me, and to protect the legacy of Blackwood as fiercely as I protect my own." The words hit him like physical blows. The sheer, unadulterated devotion in those lines was staggering. It was not the writing of a naive girl. It was the writing of a woman who had seen his flaws, seen his burdens, and chosen to shoulder them with him. He remembered her quiet smiles. He remembered the way she listened when he complained about his creditors. He remembered the vast secret fortune she had poured into the banks just to save his pride. He had held absolute unconditional loyalty in his hands, and he had thrown it away for a woman who wouldn't even let him sit in her opera box when his pockets were empty. A profound, sickening wave of realization crashed over Julian. The loss of the estate was devastating, but the loss of this, the loss of the woman who had written those words, suddenly felt like a fatal wound. Clara. Julian choked, a genuine sob breaking in his throat. He fell to his knees on the Persian rug, the Earl of Blackwood kneeling before the desk of his own ancestors, weeping openly. "Oh God, Clara! What have I done? I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly sorry." Clara looked down at him. She watched his tears fall, watched his shoulders shake, watched the total collapse of his aristocratic pride. 3 weeks ago, seeing him in this kind of pain would have broken her heart. She would have knelt beside him, gathered him in her arms, and promised to fix the world for him. Now she felt absolutely nothing. The silence inside her was immaculate. "You called me a walking bank ledger, Julian," Clara said quietly. "I decided to act like one. Ledgers do not have feelings, they do not accept apologies, they only have balances. And your account is overdrawn." Julian looked up, his face wet with tears, his eyes pleading. "Where will I go? I have nothing. I have a few £100 to my name. The autumn gala is tomorrow night. Society will know. They will see me ruined. Where you go is no longer my concern," Clara said, picking up her riding crop and her gloves. "And as for the autumn gala, I suggest you attend. It is best to face your new reality immediately. I will certainly be there." Julian froze. You are attending?" "Of course," Clara said, walking around the desk toward the doors. "Someone has to represent the Blackwood estate, and since I now hold the deeds to the house, the lands and the title's liquid assets, I believe that responsibility falls to me." She stopped at the threshold of the Grand Library, turning back to look at the broken man kneeling on the floor. "My solicitors are waiting outside with the local magistrate," Clara stated, her voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "You have 1 hour to pack whatever personal clothing fits into a single trunk. Everything else in this house belongs to me. If you are not gone in 60 minutes, you will be forcibly removed for trespassing." Julian could not speak. The finality in her voice was absolute. There was no negotiation, no mercy, no second chances. Clara Vance did not wait for a reply. She turned and walked out of the library, the sharp, rhythmic click of her boots fading down the marble hallway, leaving Julian Thorne alone with the ashes of the fire and the crumpled vows he had failed to keep. The autumn gala was the undisputed pinnacle of the London social season. Held in the cavernous gilded ballroom of the Wellington Assembly, it was a night designed for the display of power, pedigree, and wealth. Thousands of crystal prisms hung from the massive chandeliers, casting a brilliant fractured light over the swirling silks and tailored tailcoats of the country's elite. The air hummed with the sound of a string quartet, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the low, vicious murmur of aristocratic gossip. Tonight there was only one topic of conversation. Julian Thorne, the formerly untouchable Earl of Blackwood, stood near a towering marble pillar at the edge of the room. He was entirely alone. He wore an older evening suit, the velvet lapels slightly worn, his posture rigid and hollow. The men who had toasted him just weeks ago now looked right through him. The mothers who had once paraded their daughters before him now pulled them away if he caught their eye. In the brutal, silent language of high society, Julian Thorne was already a dead man. Across the room, bathed in the brightest light, Lady Sylvia Croft was holding court. She wore a gown of spun gold silk, her dark hair piled high, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. She was surrounded by a circle of attentive lords and envious ladies, projecting the aura of a woman who had narrowly escaped a tragic bore. She laughed, snapping her painted silk fan shut, making a devastatingly witty comment about men who could not manage their own ledgers. She was aggressively rewriting history, positioning herself not as the woman who had lost the Blackwood estate, but as the woman who had cleverly discarded a bankrupt fool. Julian watched her from the shadows. His hands gripping, a glass of untouched whiskey trembled violently. He had lost his home. He was living in a rented room above a tailor's shop, and the woman he had destroyed his life for was currently using his corpse as a stepping stone. At precisely 9:30, the heavy, gold-leafed double doors at the top of the grand staircase swung open. The majordomo, holding a silver staff, struck the marble floor 3 times. The sharp cracking sound cut through the music. The string quartet faltered and then faded into silence. The low hum of conversation sputtered and died rippling outward from the staircase until the massive ballroom was plunged into an absolute breathless hush. "Lady Clara Vance," the majordomo announced. His voice echoed across the quiet room. He did not announce her with an escort. He did not announce her with a title that belonged to a man. Every head in the ballroom turned. Clara stood at the top of the staircase. For a moment, no one breathed. The society that had eagerly consumed the rumors of a weeping, fragile spinster retreating to the country was entirely unprepared for the woman looking down at them. She did not wear pastel. She did not wear lace. Clara wore a gown of midnight blue velvet so dark it seemed to absorb the light from the chandeliers. It featured a high-structured collar and long sheer sleeves embroidered with jagged threads of dark silver. Her ash-blonde hair was swept up into a flawless architectural crown. There was no softness to her. She looked like a queen forged from winter iron. She began to descend the marble stairs. The click of her heels was the only sound in the room. The crowd physically parted as she reached the floor, stepping back to create a wide, respectful aisle. They were not just looking at a jilted bride. The rumors of the Blackwood foreclosure had leaked. They were looking at the woman who had quietly purchased one of the oldest earldoms in the country and snapped its neck without making a sound. Sylvia Croft, standing in the center of the room, felt the spotlight violently ripped from her. Her smile froze. Her grip on her silk fan tightened until the delicate wooden ribs groaned. She watched Clara glide across the floor, a vision of untouchable, terrifying elegance. Sylvia's vanity could not bear the silence. She needed to assert her dominance. She needed the room to remember that Clara was the woman left at the altar. Sylvia stepped forward, blocking Clara's path. "Well," Sylvia said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness, projecting loudly enough for the silent crowd to hear. "If it isn't the runaway bride, we were beginning to wonder if you would ever show your face in polite society again, Clara. It must be terribly difficult walking into a room knowing everyone is pitying you." Clara stopped. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at Sylvia with anger or sorrow. She looked at her the way one might look at a stain on a very expensive rug. "Pity," Clara repeated. Her voice was quiet, but in the dead silence of the ballroom, it carried with crystalline perfection. "Why would anyone pity me, Sylvia? I am not the one wearing last season's diamonds." To secure a dinner invitation, a few audible gasps rippled through the crowd. Sylvia's olive skin flushed a deep, ugly red. "You always did hide behind your money," Sylvia sneered, abandoning the sweet facade, her tone turning venomous. "Because it is the only thing you have. You can buy all the dark velvet in London, Clara, but it doesn't change what happened. He didn't want you. He was standing at the altar and he told me he loved me. You are nothing but a discarded checkbook." Julian, standing by the pillar, felt his stomach drop. He stepped forward instinctively, wanting to stop this, wanting to protect Clara, but his feet felt glued to the marble floor. Clara tilted her head slightly. Her pale green eyes were completely devoid of warmth. "You are half right, Sylvia," Clara said smoothly. "I am a checkbook, but I was never discarded." She took a single, deliberate step closer to Sylvia. "I understand why you are angry. You spent years lurking in the shadows of Julian's life, waiting for the Blackwood estate to be solvent enough for you to finally take your seat. You thought you had won. You thought the dull, quiet girl was going to pay the debts and you were going to reap the rewards of the title. Sylvia opened her mouth to speak, but Clara did not let her. But you miscalculated, Clara continued, her voice echoing off the gilded walls, commanding the entire room. Because you did not take Julian from me. I simply realized the asset was defective, and I dropped it. And what truly haunts you, Sylvia, is not that I have the money. It is that I now own the very estate you compromised your dignity for. You are a vulture who arrived at the feast only to find the table belonged to me. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a social execution delivered without a single raised voice. Sylvia stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, the painted fan trembling in her hand. The lords and ladies who had been hanging on to her every word moments ago were now looking at her, but with thinly veiled contempt. The illusion was shattered. She was not a grand romantic heroine, she was a failed opportunist. Sylvia turned on her heel and fled toward the side doors. Her gold dress flashing under the chandeliers, the sound of her rapid, humiliating retreat, echoing in the quiet room. Clara did not watch her go. She simply adjusted her silver-embroidered sleeve and continued walking toward the center of the room. But her path was blocked again. Julian Thorne stepped out of the shadows. He looked completely shattered. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale and drawn. The arrogance that had defined the Earl of Blackwood for 35 years was entirely gone, burned away by the devastating reality of his own actions. He stopped a few feet from her. The crowd leaned in breathless. Clara, Julian whispered. His voice was raw, breaking on the syllables. He didn't care who heard him. He didn't care about his pride anymore. Please, I was wrong. I was so incredibly blind. She meant nothing. You were the only real thing in my life, and I destroyed it. I have lost everything. Clara looked at the man she had almost married. She looked at the heavy brow, the prominent nose, the dark hair. She remembered the way she used to look at him, the way her heart used to race when he entered a room. She searched her chest for a flicker of that feeling, a spark of pity, a ghost of love. There was nothing, just the cold, steady beat of her own pulse. You have lost everything, Julian. Clara said, her voice perfectly calm, because you believe my silence was a sign of weakness. You believe my devotion was a lack of intelligence. Julian's eyes filled with tears. He fell to his knees. The gasp that swept through the Wellington assembly was deafening. The Earl of Blackwood kneeling in his worn suit on the marble floor before the entire London elite. I'm begging you. Julian sobbed, looking up at her, the tears spilling over his cheeks. Forgive me. Take me back. I don't care about the money or the title. Just let me be with you. I will be whatever you want me to be. Clara looked down at him. She did not reach out to touch him. She did not step back. She stood with the unshakable posture of a woman who had built her own fortress. I don't want you to be anything, Julian, Clara said softly, though the silence of the room carried her words to the farthest walls. I want you to be a lesson. To yourself, and to everyone in this room. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over the silent, staring aristocrats. The dukes, the countesses, the bankers, the gossips. They all looked back at her, terrified and in awe. She had their absolute respect. She had taken the room, and she had taken it forever. Clara looked back down at Julian one last time. The debt is paid, she said. She stepped around him. She did not look back. She walked toward the grand balcony doors, the midnight blue velvet of her gown sweeping across the marble floor. The crowd parted for her, bowing their heads as she passed, leaving the ruined Earl, weeping on the floor, and the silence of the ballroom ringing in his ears. She stepped out onto the balcony, the crisp November air washing over her face, and for the first time in a year, Lady Clara Vance took a deep, completely free breath.